The ravens came to Winterfell in the gray hours before dawn, as they always did when the news they carried was too heavy for daylight. Maester Luwin had read the message twice before bringing it to Eddard Stark, which was itself a kind of answer. When ravens brought good news, the old maester brought them quickly, his sandaled feet quick on the cold stone. When he delayed, when he read and reread and stood at his window watching the sky lighten over the godswood, it meant the words on the parchment were the kind that changed the shape of a man's life permanently. Ned was already awake when Luwin knocked. He had been awake for hours, sitting in the chair by the cold hearth, thinking about Lyanna, about the way she had looked at him across Robert's great celebration feast, eyes bright, alive, already half in love with the Targaryen prince and his silver hair and his harp strings, and how Ned had thought, she will come to no good end from that look. He had been right. He was usually right about the things that mattered least to prevent. My lord. Luwin set the parchment on the table between them without preamble. From Casterly Rock, Lord Tywin Lannister writes personally. Ned read it once. Then he read it again. Then he set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man handling a blade. He is not sure is sheathed. Outside, Winterfell breathed its slow winter breath, the creak of timber in cold air, the distant bark of the direwolf pups that didn't exist yet in this life, the smell of wood smoke from the kitchen fires beginning their morning work. Normal sounds. The sounds of a world that did not yet know it had shifted on its axis. Tywin Lannister's offer was elegant in the way that all truly dangerous things were elegant. Robert Baratheon sat the Iron Throne, newly won and still warm with Targaryen blood. He needed a queen, and the obvious choice, the politically perfect choice, the choice that every lord in the Seven Kingdoms assumed was already decided, was Cersei Lannister. She was the most beautiful woman in the realm. She was Tywin's heir in all but name. She was the prize that cemented alliances, the golden thread that tied the richest house in Westeros to the new dynasty. Tywin was offering her instead to Eddard Stark. The reasoning was written in the precise, bloodless language of a man who had spent 40 years treating human beings as pieces on a Sivas board. Robert Baratheon was a warrior king, great in battle, already demonstrating the appetites that would define his reign. He required a queen who would manage the court while he hunted and feasted and maintained the realm's love through his legendary charisma. Cersei Lannister was not that queen. Cersei Lannister, Tywin wrote, and here Ned had to admire the cold honesty of it. Father writing of daughter like a general assessing a weapon's best deployment is too much. Herself to be anyone else's shadow. She required a husband of sufficient strength to earn her genuine respect and sufficient honor to direct her considerable capabilities productively. The North was the realm's most strategically vulnerable flank. The Starks were its backbone. A Stark-Lannister marriage made the realm's two great pillars one structure. Robert would have Jon Arryn's steady counsel, Stannis Baratheon's military rigor, and Tywin's letter did not say this directly, but the implication sat in every careful sentence like a tooth in a jaw. He would not have the distraction of a wife who would never forgive being given to a man she did not choose. What Tywin did not write, and what Ned understood immediately, was the simpler truth beneath the strategic architecture. Tywin was afraid of what Cersei and Robert would do to each other. He had watched his daughter grow into something formidable and ungovernable, and he had watched Robert Baratheon's character in war, and he had performed a quiet calculation about what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovable object in the same marriage bed for 30 years. He was offering Cersei to Ned Stark, the way a man offers a burning torch to someone standing in the safest part of the room. Ned sent for his father's counsel and found only his own reflection in the frosted window glass. Rickard Stark was ash in memory, killed by the Mad King's fire. Brandon was bones. There was no one left to advise him except Benjen, who was 17 and looked at everything with the bright, uncomprehending eyes of a boy who had not yet learned what the world cost. Catelyn Tully, the woman Ned had been expected to marry, the woman his brother Brandon had been betrothed to before his death, waited in Riverrun. Her family's hopes and political calculations, already arranged around a different future. He thought about what his father would have said. The North needs allies, Ned. The Starks cannot stand alone forever. He thought about what Lyanna would have said. Oh, Ned. Don't be such a solemn fool. She's a person, not a political arrangement. Go and meet her before you decide. He wrote back to Tywin Lannister in the measured language of a man conducting a negotiation rather than accepting a surrender. He had conditions. He always had conditions, and he always meant them, which was perhaps the most northern thing about him. In a world of men who made promises as currency, Ned Stark made them as architecture. The reply from Casterly Rock took 8 days. Tywin accepted every condition without amendment. That, more than anything else, told Ned how badly the Lord of Casterly Rock wanted this alliance. A man who accepted every term without negotiation was a man who needed the deal more than he was willing to admit. Cersei Lannister came to Winterfell on a day in late autumn when the sky was the color of old iron and the wind came off the moors like something with intention. She rode in a Lannister wheelhouse that was extravagantly, almost aggressively out of place against the gray stone and bare trees, all gilded panels and crimson curtains. A declaration of southern wealth that the North received with the polite indifference it extended to most things it considered temporary. Ned stood at the gates and watched her descend. He had heard descriptions, of course. Every lord in the Seven Kingdoms had heard descriptions of Cersei Lannister by the time she was 16. The most beautiful woman in the realm was the phrase that traveled with her, named the way the Kingslayer traveled with her brothers. Ned had discounted it, as he discounted most things people said about other people in tones of reverence or resentment, both emotions. In his experience, distorted the truth beyond usefulness. He had been wrong to discount it, not because the descriptions were inaccurate, but because they were incomplete. Cersei Lannister was beautiful the way Valyrian steel was beautiful in a manner that made you immediately aware of its purpose. She looked at Winterfell the way a general looks at unfamiliar terrain. Her green eyes moved across the walls, the towers, the yard, the gathered household with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting an assessment rather than an arrival. When her gaze reached Ned, it paused. He met it without looking away, because he never looked away from things he needed to understand. And he could see the slight recalibration in her expression, the almost imperceptible adjustment of someone who had expected one thing and received another. He was not Robert. That was the first thing she registered. He was not loud, not red-faced with wine and enthusiasm, not the kind of man who filled a space with his presence like a fire fills a room. He was tall and still and looking at her with gray eyes that contained, as far as she could determine in that first moment, absolutely no performance whatsoever. In Cersei Lannister's experience, everyone performed. It was the first thing she had learned about the world. Beyond the rock, that every face worn in public was a costume, that every word spoken in court was a move in a game, that the only question worth asking about any person was, what are they really after? Ned Stark was looking at her, and she could not, for the first time in her life, immediately answer that question. My lady, he said, and his voice was exactly what his face promised, direct, unornamented, slightly formal in the way of a man who respected ceremony without enjoying it. Winterfell welcomes you, Lord Stark, she said, and gave him her best court smile, the one that had made lords twice his age forget what they'd been saying mid-sentence. He nodded at it, acknowledged its existence, did not appear to be particularly affected by it. Cersei Lannister filed that information away with the focused attention of someone who has just discovered that the battlefield is different from the maps. If you want to see more characters and unions collide across the universes of history, legend, and ice and fire, hit that subscribe button and drop a character and a universe you'd want to see in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure. The feast that evening was northern, which meant it was honest, hearty, and almost entirely without political theater. The wine was good, a concession to the Lannister contingent that Ned had arranged with quiet thoroughness. The food was the food of a people who understood winter, dense, warming, built for endurance. Cersei ate it with the careful attention of someone studying a foreign language. Through its cuisine, across the table, her new husband spoke with his maester about grain stores. She had expected many things from Eddard Stark. She had not expected to find herself somewhere between the second and third course, actually listening. Winter in Winterfell was not a season. It was a philosophy. Cersei understood this within the first fortnight, and understanding it did not make her love it. In King's Landing, where she had spent her formative years at court watching her father dismantle and reassemble the realm's power structures with the focused patience of a master craftsman, winter was an abstraction, something that happened to crops and small folk. In the distant north, something that lords discussed, in terms of grain stores and trade routes, and the political leverage of food scarcity. In Winterfell, winter was the organizing principle of every thought, every preparation, every stone laid in every wall. The castle had been built by people who understood that the cold was not an interruption of life, but its most honest context. The hot springs beneath the castle kept the great halls warmer than logic suggested they should be. Cersei had been told this before her arrival and had filed it alongside other northern peculiarities she expected to find quaint. Instead, she found herself standing above one of the vents in the stone floor on her third morning, letting the warmth rise through her traveling gown, and thinking that there was something almost subversive about a castle that had solved winter from underneath, rather than simply enduring it from above. Ned found her there. He had the silent movement of a man who had spent years hunting in forests, where noise meant failure, and she heard him only when he was already beside her, close enough that she could see the faint frost still in his dark hair. From his early morning ride, the builders of Winterfell were practical people, he said. By way of explanation or apology, she couldn't quite determine which. They were clever people, she corrected, and watched something in his face shift slightly. Not surprise exactly, more like the expression of a man recalibrating a measurement. He said after a moment. That too. It was not a conversation, precisely. It was two people standing over warm stone and discovering they had arrived at the same observation from different directions. In King's Landing, this would have been the beginning of an alliance, a negotiation, a subtle exchange of what each person wanted in return for agreeing with the other. Cersei waited for the second layer, the request beneath the acknowledgement, the hand extended with the blade behind the back. Ned simply stood with her for another moment, nodded once, and went to his morning duties. She stood there longer than she'd intended, trying to determine what he'd wanted from the exchange, and arriving repeatedly at the same unsatisfying answer. Nothing. He had been walking past, seen her, offered a fact about his home that he thought she might find interesting, and moved on. It was, she decided, deeply alarming. The castle learned her in the way that castles learn new inhabitants, slowly, collectively, without announcement. The servants noted that she rose before the household, that she walked the battlements in the cold morning air with her cloak pulled tight, and her eyes moving across the landscape with the systematic attention of a military surveyor. The household guard noted that she asked questions about the castle's defensive architecture that went several layers deeper than most noble ladies. Polite inquiries. Not how old is this wall, but where are the weak points, and what has been done about them. Maester Lewin noted that she requested access to the library within her first week and worked through the northern histories with the focused speed of someone who reads, not for pleasure, but for intelligence. Ned noted all of this because very little happened in Winterfell that Ned Stark did not eventually note, though he noted things in the manner of a man building a considered judgment rather than a reactive one. He said nothing about the library visits. He said nothing about the battlements. When she appeared unexpectedly at a meeting with his master-at-arms about the castle's winter preparations, and sat quietly in the corner, absorbing everything that was said, he introduced her to Ser Roderick Castle without a flicker of territorial discomfort, and then proceeded with the meeting, as though her presence required no further explanation. That evening, over a dinner that was again just the two of them, the Lannister retinue had been housed in the guest towers, and Ned seemed to feel no obligation to perform elaborate hospitality once the formal welcome period had concluded. She said, "Your western wall has a drainage problem that will become structural within 2 winters if it isn't addressed." Ned set down his spoon. "Lewin mentioned it last year. And I've been negotiating with a master builder in White Harbor. It's expensive work. I can have the funds from Casterly Rock within a month," Cersei said. "Not I could arrange, or perhaps my father might." The flat declarative of someone who does not offer what they cannot deliver. My father's wedding gift was generous but general in its purpose. I'd rather it serve something specific. Ned looked at her across the table with those level gray eyes that she had not yet learned to read with any confidence. In another man, she would have identified the calculation behind that look. What does she want in return? What is she establishing? What is the political architecture under the apparent generosity? She looked for it in Ned Stark and found only honest consideration. That's generous, he said. It's practical, she replied. I live in this castle now. I'd prefer it not to fall down. Something happened in his expression that she would later, privately, categorize as the first moment he almost smiled at something she'd said. The letters from Casterly Rock arrived weekly, written in her father's precise hand. And Cersei read them in her chambers with the door bolted, and burned them in the hearth after. This was habit as much as caution. Tywin Lannister's correspondence was never innocent of purpose, and his purpose regarding her marriage was clear. She was to establish herself as indispensable to Ned Stark, to make herself the essential hinge between Lannister wealth and northern military strength, to be the most capable thing in Winterfell without ever letting Winterfell see the full extent of what capable meant. You are my greatest work, her father had told her once. In the brief, honest period after her mother's death, when Tywin had occasionally said things he meant, but a weapon that reveals itself is a weapon half disarmed. She wrote back to him in careful language that told him what he wanted to hear while telling him as little as possible about what she was actually thinking. This was another habit. She had been practicing it since she was 9 years old and had understood that even a father's love, particularly Tywin Lannister's love, was conditional on usefulness. What she did not write to him was the thing she was slowly and reluctantly, and with considerable internal resistance, beginning to understand about her husband. That Eddard Stark was the most genuinely difficult person she had ever attempted to manage, not because he was suspicious or hostile or politically sophisticated in the conventional sense, but because he was entirely and consistently himself in a way that left her standard tools with nothing to grip. You could not flatter a man who did not want flattery. You could not threaten a man who did not appear to fear consequences. You could not manipulate a man who never performed, who had no gap between his public face and his private, one that you could slide a lever into and apply pressure. What you could do, she was discovering, was talk to him. This was not a tool she had much experience with. Conversation in King's Landing was always instrumental. You said things to get things, to plant things, to establish things. The idea of conversation as simply the exchange of genuine thought between two people was one she associated with naivety and political vulnerability. And yet, on the 14th night of her marriage, Ned had returned from a late meeting with his bannermen to find her still awake, sitting by the fire with a northern history open on her lap. And instead of going to bed or retreating to his solar, he had sat in the other chair and said, "What are you reading?" She had told him, defensively at first, waiting for the condescension that men of his era reliably produced when they discovered women reading political history. It did not come. He asked instead what she made of the account's treatment of the Stark-Bolton conflict. And when she gave him a carefully diplomatic non-answer, he looked at her with faint impatience and said, "I'd rather know what you actually think." What followed was an hour that Cersei Lannister could not subsequently explain to herself in any framework she trusted. They had disagreed about 3 things, agreed about 2 others, and she had said something about the Bolton tendency toward strategic betrayal that made Ned set down his cup and look at her as though she had just confirmed a long-held theory. "That's exactly right," he said. "I've thought the same thing and never found the right words for it." She went to sleep that night with the disorienting conviction that her husband was, by several measures she did not want to apply, the most honest person she had ever met. And that honesty, she was beginning to understand, was not the weakness she had been raised to believe it was. It was, in a man like this, in a castle like this, in a world that did not yet know what was coming from the north, something considerably more frightening than that. It was a foundation. Robert Baratheon's court was loud in the way that insecure things are loud, filling every silence with noise because silence, in King's Landing, had a way of asking questions no one wanted answered. Ned and Cersei made the journey south in the 2nd year of their marriage. summoned by a royal command that wore the costume of an invitation. Robert wanted his oldest friend at court. He wanted to show the realm that the Stark-Lannister alliance was his alliance, that the two great pillars of his kingdom stood not independently but in service to his throne. These were the political reasons, and they were real enough. Underneath them, Ned suspected, was something simpler and less dignified. Robert was lonely in the particular way of powerful men who have everything except the thing they actually wanted, and the thing Robert Baratheon had actually wanted, and the thing Robert Baratheon had actually wanted, since before the rebellion that made him king, was Lyanna Stark. She was ash in memory. So Robert had settled for the Iron Throne and was discovering, at considerable cost to everyone around him, that it made a poor substitute. Cersei had prepared for the journey with the focused intensity she brought to everything she identified as a strategic event, which was everything. She had spent 3 weeks composing her wardrobe with Winterfell's limited resources supplemented by 2 chests sent from Casterly Rock, the careful balance between Lannister wealth and northern practicality that had become, in small ways, the signature of her public presentation. She had drilled herself on the current political landscape of King's Landing with the thoroughness of a general, studying an unfamiliar battlefield, who had risen, who had fallen, where Littlefinger's influence now reached, what Varys's little birds were carrying between their small hands. What she had not prepared for, because she had believed she did not need to, was Robert himself. She had met him before, briefly at the great victory feast after the rebellion. He had been enormous and golden, and electric with triumph, the kind of man who generated his own weather. And she had understood immediately why men followed him into impossible battles and why women looked at him the way they looked at a fire in winter, attractive and dangerous in equal measure and aware of both. 2 years of kingship had not diminished him physically. If anything, he was more present, more overwhelming, filling the throne room at King's Landing with his laugh, and his appetites and his restless energy, in a way that made the gilded space feel small. What 2 years of kingship had done was make him unhappy in ways he was not equipped to examine. He embraced Ned in the throne room with genuine warmth, the embrace of a man greeting the truest friend of his youth, uncomplicated by politics or performance, and Ned returned it with the same unaffected sincerity that Cersei had spent a year learning to stop waiting for the ulterior motive behind. Watching them together, she understood something she had theorized but not yet seen confirmed, that Robert Baratheon's love for Eddard Stark was the realest thing in him, possibly the only real thing left. Then Robert turned to her, and the warmth recalibrated into something more complex. "Lady Stark," he said, and his eyes moved over her with the frank assessment he applied to everything he considered beautiful, the look of a man who has never learned to want things quietly. "The North agrees with you. The North is honest with me," Cersei said, meeting his gaze with the steady composure she had spent years building into armor. "I find I prefer it." Something flickered in Robert's expression, surprise, perhaps, or the faint discomfort of a man who has just been told a truth he recognizes as true but would rather not. Beside her, she felt Ned's stillness, which was his version of attention. He went quiet in the way of deep water when something important was happening near the surface. "Honest," Robert said, and laughed, but the laugh had an edge to it. "Ned's rubbing off on you, then. God's help us all." The court laughed because the court always laughed when the king did, and Cersei smiled with the precise warmth of a woman who has not forgotten a single thing said in her presence in 20 years. Robert moved on to greet the banner men behind them, and the moment dissolved into the general noise of the throne room's daily theater. That night, in the chambers assigned to them in Maegor's Holdfast, Ned said, "He's not well." Cersei, who had reached the same conclusion by different routes, said, "No, he drinks more than he did. Men who are unhappy drink. It's one of the more reliable laws of the realm." Ned sat on the edge of the bed with the thoughtful heaviness he carried when something was troubling him, not the anxious restlessness of a worried man, but the settled weight of one who is working through a problem with the full attention it deserves. "He needs better counsel than he's getting. He needs," Cersei said carefully, "to be managed, which is not the same thing as counseled, and which Robert Baratheon will never permit." because it would require him to admit he needs managing. She paused. Jon Arryn does his best. Jon Arryn is a good man. Jon Arryn is an old man who loves Robert like a father and therefore cannot see him clearly. She said it without cruelty, the flat assessment of someone who has been studying the court's power, architecture since childhood. You see him clearly. Ned looked at her. What are you suggesting? Nothing yet, she said, and meant it. I'm observing. Littlefinger found her on the third day, because Littlefinger always found the person worth finding with the unerring instinct of a man who has built his entire existence on identifying value before anyone else does. He was smaller than she remembered from her childhood visits. Or rather, he had always been small, but the smirk that rode his face like a permanent fixture made him seem larger than his physical presence warranted. Master of coin now, elevated by Robert's chaotic patronage system to a position that gave him legitimate access to every financial pressure point in the realm. Cersei had read 3 separate assessments of his influence from sources she trusted, and had concluded that each of them underestimated him. Lady Stark, he said, falling into step beside her in the corridor outside the small council chamber with the practiced casualness of a man who has rehearsed the encounter while making it appear spontaneous. You look remarkably well for someone who spent 2 years in the north. Most Southerners don't survive the adjustment. I'm not most Southerners, Cersei said, without breaking stride. No, Littlefinger agreed, matching her pace with irritating ease. You're considerably more interesting than most Southerners. Which raises the question of what you make of us now that you've had the perspective of distance. I make of you what I always made of you, Lord Baelish. Someone who asks questions as a way of providing answers he wants you to think are your own. A pause, then a smile that was, she had to admit, genuinely delighted. Lady Stark, I see the North has not softened you. The North, she said, stopping at the corridor's end and turning to face him with the full force of her attention, which she had learned to deploy like weather, taught me that the most dangerous thing in any room is the person who doesn't need anything from you. I suggest you consider what that means for this conversation. She left him there and did not look back to see his expression, because looking back was how you told people they'd made an impression. Varys was more subtle, which meant he was more dangerous. He came to her not directly, but through the architecture of coincidence. A shared garden, a chance encounter at the library, a conversation that began with books and arrived at politics through a route so scenic that you forgot you were traveling until you were already there. The realm watches your marriage with considerable interest, he said, his soft voice carrying the particular quality of a whisper that could fill a room. A Stark and a Lannister bound together. It reorders certain calculations. Calculations are meant to be reordered when new information arrives. Cersei said, that's rather the point of them. Indeed. Varys folded his hands in his sleeves with the placid composure of a man who keeps his weapons somewhere no one can see them. Lord Stark is a profoundly honest man. He is. It must be, Varys said, with the delicacy of a surgeon selecting an instrument. An interesting experience. For someone of your particular intelligence. Sustained proximity to genuine honesty. Cersei looked at him for a long moment. The spider, the master of whisperers. The man who claimed to serve the realm while serving. Something none of them had yet identified with confidence. She thought of Ned, in his chair by the fire, asking what she actually thought. She thought of the Western Wall and the drainage problem, and the hour of honest conversation that she still couldn't categorize. It's clarifying, she said finally, in the way that cold air is clarifying. You see everything very precisely. Varys nodded slowly, his eyes bright and unreadable. And what do you see, my lady? Now that you see so precisely. She smiled, not the court smile, not the weapon. Something she had found somewhere. In the gray stone corridors of Winterfell. That was adjacent to actual expression. I see a king who is unhappy and a court that profits from his unhappiness. I see a realm that has survived its war and is looking for its next one because peace is harder than fighting for most men. She tilted her head. And I see you, Lord Varys, trying to determine whether I am an asset or a variable. And which are you? Neither, Cersei said. I'm a Lannister who married a Stark. We don't fit existing categories. I suggest you build new ones. She walked away from him into the warm southern afternoon and thought of the frozen godswood at Winterfell, and thought of her husband, and thought that she was becoming someone she had not planned to be. The thought was not entirely unwelcome, which was, she reflected, perhaps the most alarming development of all. Tywin Lannister came to King's Landing on the 9th day of their visit, and the court rearranged itself. Around his arrival the way iron filings rearrange around a lodestone, not from affection, but from the simpler physics of power recognizing power. He had not been invited. This was itself a communication, written in the language of great lords who have spent enough decades at the center of events to understand that arriving uninvited to a king's court is a demonstration of confidence that invited guests can never replicate. Robert received him with the forced good humor of a man who finds a wolf at his table and decides the wisest response is to offer it wine. The small counsel straightened imperceptibly. Littlefinger's smile did not change, but his eyes sharpened behind it like a blade being drawn slowly from a sheath. Ned received him with the particular northern courtesy that Cersei had been studying for 2 years. The courtesy that was not warmth, not hostility, but the precise temperature of a man who respects what deserves respect and reserves judgment on everything else until the evidence is complete. Tywin received Ned's courtesy with something Cersei had not, in all her years as his daughter, seen her father extend to many people. Something that was not quite respect. Tywin Lannister's respect was a fortress with very few gates, but was adjacent to it. The recognition of a man who does not perform, by a man who has spent his life performing, that there might be a different kind of strength in the absence of performance. He received his daughter in private, in the chambers he had taken in the Tower of the Hand, not his chambers, Jon Arryn's chambers, but Tywin occupied spaces, according to their strategic value, rather than their assignment. And the Tower of the Hand had the best sight lines for what he needed to observe. Cersei sat across the table from her father and felt, as she always felt in his presence, the particular combination of pride and suffocation that was his specific emotional signature. He had made her everything she was. He had also made her in the shape of his own ambitions rather than hers, and the difference between those two shapes was something she had only recently begun to measure. "You look well," Tywin said, studying her with the clinical thoroughness he applied to military assessments. "The North has not diminished you. I told you it wouldn't. You told me many things before the marriage. I was interested to see which of them were accurate." He poured wine, Arbor Gold, brought with him, because Tywin Lannister did not drink inferior wine in anyone else's space. "Your letters have been informative without being particularly revealing. I learned from the best." A thin acknowledgement crossed his face. "Tell me about your husband." Cersei considered the question, not the obvious answer, not the diplomatic answer, but the true one, which she had been assembling in the back of her mind for 2 years like a mosaic laid one small piece at a time. "He is exactly what he appears to be," she said, "which is the most disorienting thing I have ever encountered in a person of consequence." Tywin's expression did not change, but something shifted in his attention. "Explain." "There is no second layer," Cersei said. "Everything he says, he means. Every position he takes, he holds. He does not threaten what he will not do, does not promise what he cannot deliver, does not perform loyalty while calculating betrayal." She paused. "In King's Landing this would be a fatal weakness. In Winterfell it is something else entirely." "What is it in Winterfell?" "Authority," she said. "Absolute and unquestioned. His bannermen would follow him into the sea if he asked it. Not because they fear him, but because they have never once seen him be untrue. You cannot buy that. You cannot manufacture it." She met her father's eyes. "You and I have spent our lives building power through leverage and fear, and the careful management of perception. Ned Stark has built something that requires none of those tools and is stronger for their absence." Tywin was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was genuinely processing something, rather than formulating a response. It was a rare quiet. She had seen it perhaps 4 times in her life. "And yet," he said finally, "honor without political sophistication has a consistent, historical outcome in Westeros." "Yes," Cersei agreed, "which is why it requires someone beside him who has the sophistication he lacks." She said it without particular emphasis, but she watched her father hear the implication. the thing she was not quite saying directly, which was that she had found her purpose in this marriage, not in managing Ned Stark, but in completing him, in being the political mind that his honor could not be, and having his honor be the foundation that her political mind had never had. Tywin looked at her for a long time. "You are not unhappy," he said, and the observation carried a faint note of surprise he was not quite able to suppress. "No," Cersei said, "I am not." The friction came, as it always did in King's Landing, from the spaces between what people said and what they meant. Ned had been at court for 5 days before he began to see it. The architecture of the small corruptions that held the capital together, the way Robert's governance worked not through active policy, but through the tolerance of competing interests that canceled each other out, the careful maintenance of a balance that looked like stability from a distance and looked like a slowly filling pot from anywhere closer. Littlefinger's fingers in the treasury, the gold cloak's casual brutality in the streets, the way the small councils meetings produced decisions that never quite addressed the things that most needed addressing. On the 6th evening, he came to their chambers with the look he wore when something had crystallized for him, not the troubled expression of a man who has discovered a problem, but the settled grimness of one who has confirmed a suspicion he wished had remained unconfirmed. "Littlefinger is stealing from the crown," he said, with the directness of someone delivering a military report. Cersei looked up from the correspondence she was composing. "Yes." A pause. "You knew?" "I suspected. The crown's debt has grown faster than any combination of legitimate expenses explains. Lord Baelish is too intelligent to steal clumsily, which means the theft is architectural, built into the accounting systems themselves in ways that require the same intelligence to find." She set down her quill. "How did you find it?" "I asked the right people the right questions." Ned sat, the exhaustion of a man who has been conducting investigations in a hostile environment, present in the set of his shoulders. 3 of the harbor masters, 2 guild representatives, 1 very frightened royal accountant. That's direct. It worked. Cersei studied him. It worked because people in this city are so accustomed to being asked questions for ulterior motives that a man asking questions with no motive beyond wanting the truth is completely disarming. They didn't know how to deflect honesty. Something in Ned's expression shifted, the acknowledgement of a man who has received a genuine insight from an unexpected direction. "I hadn't thought of it that way." "You don't have to think of it that way for it to be true." She rose from her desk and came to sit across from him, the firelight between them. "The question is what you do with what you've found. And that question has more than one answer. The answer is we bring it to Robert." "That is one answer," Cersei said carefully. "The answer that is most immediately satisfying and most likely to produce the worst possible outcome." Ned's gray eyes found hers. "Explain." "Littlefinger controls the crown's finances. Not merely administers them, controls them. In the way that a man controls something when no one else fully understands how it works. Removing him without a replacement who can untangle what he's built creates a financial crisis that destabilizes the throne faster than his theft does." She paused, watching Ned process this with the focused attention he gave to all unwelcome complications. "Furthermore, Robert will not want to hear it. Not because he doesn't value honesty, but because hearing it requires him to act, and acting on it requires political confrontation. And Robert Baratheon has spent 2 years as king, discovering that political confrontation is less satisfying than actual confrontation and significantly harder to resolve with a sword." The fire crackled between them. A raven called somewhere in the night beyond the window. "So we say nothing," Ned said, and the words carried the specific distaste of a man proposing something that goes against his every instinct. "We say nothing yet," Cersei corrected. "We find a replacement who can inherit Littlefinger's systems and dismantle them from inside. We build the case with more evidence so that when we bring it to Robert, it is so complete and so unambiguous that even his reluctance cannot find purchase. We do it correctly, which takes longer and requires patience." She met his eyes steadily. "Can you do that?" "Wait, when waiting feels like dishonesty." Ned was quiet for a long moment. The fire moved. The raven called again, or a different raven. "It's not dishonesty," he said finally, as though he were testing the shape of the idea. It's strategy. Yes, I don't love strategy. I know. Something moved in Cersei's chest, not quite warmth, but adjacent to it, the feeling of a foundation being tested and holding. That's why you married me. It was the most honest thing she had said to him in 2 years. She knew it the moment it left her, and she watched it land in his expression, the slight widening, the stillness, the recalibration of a man who has received something real and is determining what it means. Ned said after a moment. Maybe it is. Outside, King's Landing went about its evening business. The torches lit along the street of steel, the sounds of the harbor carrying up the hill, the distant noise of a city too large for any one person to fully hold in their mind. Inside, in a room that smelled of southern candles and northern pragmatism, two people who had been arranged like pieces on a board were beginning, quietly and without ceremony, to play their own game. Neither of them noticed, in that moment, that they were being watched. In the corridor outside, a small child with a coin in his hand and very good ears moved silently away toward the Tower of the Hand, where the Master of Whisperers sat with his fingers folded in his sleeves, waiting for the evening's reports. The children came in the order that life arranges things, not according to plan or preference, but according to the particular logic of two people learning, slowly and without instruction manual, how to occupy the same life. The first was a girl, born in Winterfell's third winter with the focused intensity that Cersei brought to everything she attempted, arriving in the gray hours before dawn in a manner that Maester Luwin later described in his private notes as purposeful, as though the child had assessed the situation and determined the optimal moment. They named her Alicent, Ned's choice, a northern name from the old histories, strong and unornamented, and Cersei accepted it with the equanimity she had developed about northern things, which was to say she accepted it genuinely rather than graciously, having learned that the difference between those two states was the difference between armor and skin. She had not expected to be undone by a child. She had watched Jaime's response to small things, the kittens their mother had kept, the children of servants who wandered the rocks, corridors, and recognized in it something she had diagnosed as weakness, the vulnerability of caring about something small and helpless in a world that specialized in destroying small and helpless things. She had armored herself against it with the logical argument that love was leverage and leverage was danger. Alicent looked at her from the first hour with Ned's gray eyes and Cersei's face, and Cersei felt the armor develop a crack that she knew, with the resigned clarity of someone who has studied structural engineering, was not going to seal itself. Ned held his daughter with the unself-conscious ease of a man who had grown up in a large family, who understood that small people required large gentleness. And watching him, this particular man with this particular smallness cradled against his chest, Cersei felt something that she would not name for another year and a half, because naming it felt like vulnerability, and vulnerability felt like the beginning of loss. The second child was a boy, and this one she named Willem, for no Lannister ancestor and no northern legend, simply because she liked the sound of it and Ned did not object, which was his way of saying he was pleased to let her have the choice. Willem arrived with red gold hair that made Maester Luwin look twice and the household looked thoughtfully at Cersei and then at each other, and Cersei looked back at all of them with the level composure of a woman who has done nothing that requires explanation and dares anyone to suggest otherwise. The hair was simply the Lannister inheritance asserting itself. This was true. It was also, she was aware, the kind of truth that required no assistance from her to be believed. And so she offered none, and the household accepted it because Ned accepted it. And what Ned Stark accepted tended to close conversations rather than open them. Ned loved his children with the same uncomplicated totality he brought to everything he valued. He was present in ways that men of his station were not expected to be present, at the small things, the daily things, the unheroic, ordinary architecture of children's lives. He taught Alicent to ride before she asked to learn. He sat with Willem through a winter fever for 3 nights, straight, and emerged on the 4th morning gray-faced and unchanged in his intention to sit a 4th if required. Cersei watched this and performed her own private accounting. She had been raised by a father who loved her in the mode of a craftsman, loving his finest work, with pride and investment and the particular blindness of a creator who cannot see his creation except as an extension of his own will. She had understood this intellectually for years. She was understanding it now, watching Ned with their children, in a different register, the register of the body rather than the mind, the place where knowledge becomes feeling and feeling becomes the thing that changes you. She did not become soft. This was important to her, and she maintained it with the same focused discipline she brought to everything she identified as essential. Winterfell required capability, not sentiment, and her children would require a mother who was formidable on their behalf, rather than simply devoted. The devotion was already there, installed without her permission, operating without her supervision. The capability was the thing she could control. She began teaching Alicent at 4 years old, not the embroidery and courtesies that a girl of her station was traditionally offered, but the things Cersei had taught herself in King's Landing's libraries and corridors, reading political histories and watching her father work. How houses rose and fell, how alliances were made and what made them hold, how to read a room's power structure from the arrangement of its occupants, how to say one thing while communicating another, and more importantly, this was the Northern Edition, the thing Winterfell had given her, how to know when honesty was more powerful than strategy. Ned found her in the middle of one of these lessons. Alicent at 6 years old, sitting across from her mother, with the focused attention that was her primary inheritance from both parents, and listened from the doorway for several minutes before entering. "You're teaching her the game," he said that evening, not accusatory, genuinely curious, the tone of a man who wants to understand something before forming a judgment about it. "I'm teaching her to survive it," Cersei said. "Which is different, is it? The game exists whether you play it or not. The only choice is whether you play it well or poorly." She met his eyes across the hearth. "She is a Stark. She will have the North's honesty in her blood. That is an extraordinary gift, but it is not sufficient armor by itself, and I will not send her into the world with only half the tools she needs because her mother was too romantic about honor to teach her the rest." Ned was quiet for a moment. "Then, teach her both. Not one or the other. That's what I'm doing. Then teach her what I teach Robb and Jon as well." He said this with the simplicity of someone who has thought it through and found no obstacle. She should learn to ride properly, to handle a blade, to understand a defensive position. A pause. "She is a Stark. That means all of it." Cersei looked at her husband and found him entirely serious. The idea that his daughter's education might include a sword was not, for Ned Stark, a radical proposition but a practical one. The North made practical people. All of it, she agreed. It was Alicent who first heard the argument between her parents that the household would afterward refer to only in careful circumlocutions, not because the argument was scandalous, but because it involved a level of genuine feeling that the Winterfell household, accustomed to their lord's composed authority and their lady's measured presentation, did not quite know how to categorize. It began with a raven from King's Landing. Jon Arryn was ill. Gravely, suddenly, inexplicably ill. The message was from Lisa Tully, his wife, and it contained, between its formal lines of report, a note of something that Cersei read twice and then sat within the particular stillness of a woman who has spent her life reading what people mean beneath what they say. He was asking questions, the note implied without stating. Questions about things he should not have found to question. Ned read the message and his face went to the expression Cersei had catalogued as his deepest concern, not the troubled look that accompanied political problems, but the older, quieter expression. That meant he was thinking about something that mattered more than politics. "We should go to him," he said. "Yes," Cersei said. And then, carefully, what questions was he asking? Ned looked at her. "What do you mean?" Lisa's message implies he was investigating something before he fell ill. She kept her voice level. "I want to know what he found, Ned. Because whatever made Jon Arryn ill may not be a sickness that Maester Pycelle can treat." The silence that followed was the specific silence of two people, arriving simultaneously at an implication. Neither is ready to speak. "You think someone poisoned him," Ned said. "I think powerful men who ask inconvenient questions in King's Landing have a historical tendency toward unexpected illness," Cersei said. And I think we should know what questions Jon Arryn was asking. Before we walk into that city without our guard, who would poison the hand of the king? Cersei looked at her husband. This honest man, this northern foundation, this person who had spent 2 years unknowingly, teaching her that strength without truth was performance, and felt, for the first time since their marriage, the specific cold of genuine fear. Not for herself, for him. Someone, she said quietly, who was afraid of what honest men find when they look too closely at the wrong things. Outside the window of Winterfell's great tower, the wind moved through the godswood with a sound like distant whispers. The red leaves of the heart tree caught the dying afternoon light and held it briefly, burning, before releasing it into the coming dark. In King's Landing, Jon Arryn was dying, and somewhere in the machinery of the capital's power, something that had been moving in, Shadow was beginning to understand that the Stark Lannister alliance was not the manageable variable it had calculated it to be. Jon Arryn died on a Tuesday, which was the kind of mundane detail that history swallowed without ceremony. Great men ending on ordinary days. The world declining to adjust its calendar in acknowledgement. The Ravens reached Winterfell 3 days later, and by that time Ned had already made his decision, which meant the Ravens were confirmation rather than catalyst. Robert's summons arrived the same day, dressed in the language of grief and need. Come south. Old friend, I require you. The realm requires you, and underneath, the genuine sorrow of a king who had lost the closest thing he had to a father. Cersei read the political reality with the automatic fluency of someone who had been decoding royal communications since childhood. Robert needed a hand. Robert trusted no one in his court the way he trusted Ned. Robert's grief and Robert's political necessity had arrived at the same solution simultaneously, and the combination of personal feeling and strategic requirement meant the summons carried a weight that a purely political request would not have had. Ned would go. Cersei had known this before the Raven arrived, in the same way she had learned to know things about her husband not through the calculation of his likely behavior, but through the simpler and more disorienting process of understanding him. He would go because Jon Arryn had been his father's contemporary and his own mentor in the ways of Southern politics, because Robert was his oldest friend and genuinely needed him, and because Ned Stark did not decline genuine need when he had the capacity to answer it. What Cersei had not yet determined was whether she would go with him. This was the argument that Alicent had overheard from the corridor outside the Solar, sitting with her back against the cold stone in the way of children who have learned that adults say more when they believe they are alone. You should stay, Ned said. Not a command. He did not command her, had never attempted it, which she had initially catalogued as weakness and now understood as the specific respect of a man who recognizes capability rather than performing deference to it. The children need at least one of us here. Robb can manage the North's governance with your counsel behind him. You know these houses and their politics as well as any of my bannermen. Robb is 14, Cersei said. And you were managing your father's political correspondence. At 12. A pause. I'm not suggesting you stay because I doubt your capability in King's Landing. I'm suggesting it because your capability is needed here. And in King's Landing, Cersei said, you will be walking into a court full of people who are very good at destroying honest men, without anyone beside you who understands how they work. I've managed before. You managed a 6-day visit with me present, she said. And the precision of it, the refusal to soften a true thing, was so northern, so entirely Winterfell, that she felt the irony of it like a physical sensation. She had learned directness from him and was now deploying it against him. You have not managed King's Landing alone for an extended period. The last Stark who went south, alone and unprepared, to manage the court's machinery. She stopped. The sentence did not need its ending. They both knew what happened to Ned's father. They both knew what happened to his brother. The Mad King was ash in history, but the principle survived him. King's Landing was a place that consumed northern honor with particular efficiency. Ned was quiet for a long moment. The fire moved from somewhere in the castle's upper levels. Willem could be heard, engaged in an argument with his nursemaid about the relative merits of sleeping, a debate he conducted nightly and lost consistently. If you come with me, Ned said finally, Tywin will see it as Lannister influence. moving into the hands position. Through you, Tywin will see whatever actually happens, which is what he always does. And he will approve because it strengthens the Lannister position in the capital, which is what he always wants. Cersei met her husband's eyes across the width of the solar. But that is not why I'm coming. I'm coming because Jon Arryn died asking questions that someone didn't want answered, and I want to know what those questions were. And I am significantly better equipped to find that out than you are. Because you think like they do. The words landed without the cruelty they might have carried in another context. Because Ned did not speak in cruelties, he spoke in observations. And this one was accurate, and they both knew it. She had thought, for a moment, in the first months of their marriage, that his honesty would eventually be used as a weapon against her, that he would find a way to make her feel reduced by the comparison between his moral clarity and her political fluency. He had not. He had accepted the difference between them with the same even-handed respect he applied to differences in skill or temperament in his bannermen, as information rather than judgment. Because I think like they do, she confirmed, which makes me useful in ways that your virtues do not make you useful. We have established this. The silence was shorter this time. The children. Alicent will be fine. She is 6 years old and already more capable than half your bannerman's heirs. A pause. Something softening at the edge of her composure in the way that only happened when the children were mentioned. The crack in the armor that she had stopped trying to seal. She has your character, Ned. She will not be diminished by your absence. She will be made by it, the way northern children are made by hard things. And Willem will be furious and will channel it into becoming twice as difficult for the next year. Something moved in her expression, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the expression she had developed in Winterfell that was related to actual amusement, rather than its performance. He takes after me in that respect. He will be fine. Ned looked at her across the room, and she recognized the look, the one she had first seen on her second morning in Winterfell, standing over the warm stones, when he had realized she had assessed his castle's defensive weaknesses and filed the information in the same register as tactical intelligence. The look of a man acknowledging that the person across from him is right, and that being right matters more than who is right. Together, then, he said. Together, she agreed. King's Landing received them with the particular elaborate welcome of a court performing grief while simultaneously managing succession, the black banners for Jon Arryn alongside the gold for the king, the solemn faces of the small council members who had already begun their private calculations about the new hand before the old one was properly cold. Cersei watched the welcome from behind her composed public face and took inventory with the focused efficiency of a general assessing a battlefield immediately before engagement. Littlefinger's greeting was too warm by precisely the right amount to seem genuine. Varys's was appropriately restrained, his eyes moving between Ned and Cersei with the data-gathering attention of someone updating a complex model. Grand Maester Pycelle's was the greeting of an old man performing deference while privately determining what the new arrangement meant for his position. And Jaime, her brother, was waiting in the throne room with the rest of the King's Guard, white cloak and golden hair, and the particular stillness of a man containing himself. And when their eyes met across the gilded space, something passed between them that was the compressed language of siblings who have known each other from birth, love and complication, and the unresolved question of what they were to each other now that her life had become something neither of them had anticipated. She had written to him through the 2 years, carefully, the letters of a sister to a brother, nothing that could be misread, nothing that the wrong eyes finding the wrong parchment could use, but honest, in the way that Winterfell had made her honest, which was to say more honest than she had ever been in King's Landing's atmosphere of managed truth. He had written back. His letters had the quality of someone learning a new language, the careful construction of a man trying to say real things in a register he didn't fully trust. She had read them 3 times each and then burned them, because she was still a Lannister and certain habits survived philosophical revision. Now he crossed the throne room toward her with the unconscious physical grace that was his primary Lannister inheritance, and she saw him see Ned beside her, not the political variable, not the northern lord who had taken what might have been his sister's life in a different direction, but the actual man, and saw the assessment that crossed his face before the court smile replaced it. "Sister," Jaime said, and embraced her with the genuine warmth of someone who has missed a person. Over her shoulder, she felt him extend his hand to Ned. "Lord Stark, the realm is fortunate to have you as hand." "Sir Jaime," Ned said, and shook the hand of the Kingslayer with the same uncomplicated directness he brought to every human encounter, not forgetting what Jaime had done, never forgetting it, but not making the greeting bear the weight of that history either. A man to be assessed on present evidence as well as past record. Jaime blinked, recovered, met Cersei's eyes over Ned's shoulder with an expression that said, quite clearly, "He is not what I expected." "No," she replied, in the silent language they had spoken since childhood. "He never is." The questions Jon Arryn had been asking were not difficult to find, once you knew how to look. Cersei found the first thread within 4 days, through a conversation with a harbor master's wife at a gathering she had engineered through 3 layers of social maneuvering that she subsequently reflected had been unnecessarily elaborate. Ned could have simply asked the harbor master directly, and the man would have answered, because people answered Ned's direct questions with the disarmed honesty of those who have never been asked anything without an ulterior motive. But Cersei found the thread, and it led where she had feared it would lead. Jon Arryn had been visiting bastards, specifically black-haired bastards in the city's less prosperous quarters, cross-referencing them against something she had not yet identified. He had borrowed a book from the Citadel's King's Landing repository 3 weeks before his death, a genealogical text, dry as dust, concerning the inheritance of dominant physical traits through Westerosi noble bloodlines. She sat with this information in the quiet of their chambers, turning it in her mind the way you turn a stone that you already know will have something unpleasant underneath. She had known, in the abstract, that this question existed. She had known it the way you know that a structural crack exists in a wall, aware of it, not looking at it directly, maintaining the kind of focused, peripheral ignorance that keeps functioning what would otherwise need to be torn down. Robert Baratheon's children, in every recorded Baratheon generation, had inherited the house's dominant trait with the reliability of a mathematical principle. Black hair, strong and dark and unmistakable. Joffrey, Robert's eldest, born to a queen Robert had barely touched since their first year of marriage. A queen who had been offered to a northern lord in another version of events, and had instead been given to a king who wanted only what he couldn't have, had hair the color of pale gold. Cersei was looking at a wall she had been not looking at for years, and the crack had grown considerably larger than she remembered. The book sat on the table between them like a verdict. Ned had found it in her hands when he returned from his first small council session, the genealogical text, its pages worn at the edges from Jon Arryn's handling, its margins containing the dead hand's careful annotations in the precise script of a man who had spent decades processing uncomfortable information with scholarly detachment. Cersei had not hidden it. She had considered hiding it. In the half-second between hearing Ned's footsteps in the corridor and his hand on the door, and had decided against concealment, with the same internal mechanism that had been recalibrating her instincts for 3 years, the growing understanding that with this particular man, in this particular marriage, concealment was not protection but erosion. She set it on the table and sat back and waited. Ned read Jon Arryn's annotations with the focused stillness of a man who reads slowly because he reads completely, absorbing not just the words but their implications, the spaces between them, what they meant arranged in this order on this page in a dead man's hand. The fire moved. A raven called somewhere in the tower's upper levels. The sounds of King's Landing came through the window, the city's perpetual noise, its 1,000 simultaneous transactions and arguments and entertainments, the vast and different machinery of a capital that did not pause for individual reckonings. When Ned finished, he set the book down. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Cersei. "How long have you known?" he asked. The question was remarkable for what it did not contain. No accusation, no performance of betrayal. The straightforward inquiry of a man who needs accurate information before he can think clearly, and who trusts the person across from him to provide it, which was itself a form of pressure more sophisticated than any Cersei had encountered in King's Landing's arsenal of leverages, because it was not pressure at all, but simply expectation. And the expectation of an honest man is harder to disappoint than the threat of a dangerous one. I have suspected, she said carefully, for longer than I have known. The knowing, what I can state rather than fear, is more recent. She met his eyes. I found the book 4 days ago. I have been building the secondary evidence since. The pattern is consistent and it is not ambiguous. Joffrey and the others, all of Cersei's, all of the Queen's children. The slip was small, but she felt it, the brief dissociation of speaking about herself in the third person as though that other Cersei, the one who had married Robert in this world's original arrangement, were a separate person she was analyzing rather than a road not taken. In this world, in this timeline, the Queen Robert married. Ned was quiet with this for a moment that felt longer than it was. Who was the father? The question she had hoped, without real conviction, he would not ask. Not because she intended to withhold. She had passed the point of intended withholding. Had passed it somewhere. In the second year of marriage, when she had stopped composing her answers before she delivered them to this man. But because the answer was the most dangerous word in the Seven Kingdoms. And speaking it in this room made it real in a way that all her private knowing had not. Jaime, she said. The name sat in the room's air like smoke. Ned did not move, did not alter his expression dramatically, did not produce the performance of moral outrage that another man would have reached for automatically. He absorbed it with the same deep stillness he brought to all things that required genuine reckoning, a stillness that was not numbness but its opposite, the absolute attentiveness of someone, feeling the full weight of a thing without flinching from it. You're certain, he said. I am certain of the physical evidence. The genealogical pattern is unambiguous. A pause. I am certain of what I know of my brother. She did not look away from his eyes. In another life, in the life that this marriage replaced, I believe this would have continued. I believe children would have been born to the Queen and claimed as Robert's heirs. I believe Jon Arryn found what he found, and I believe he was killed for it. And I believe the king's heir would have been a Lannister bastard on the Iron Throne. But not in this life, Ned said. No. The word came out with a certainty that surprised her slightly. The sound of something she had known without articulating. Not in this life. I married you instead. Jaime, she stopped, assembled the next words with care. What exists between twins is not a simple thing to explain or defend, but it belongs to a version of a life I did not live. What I have built here is not that. Ned looked at her for a long time. She held the look without the usual calculation of what a look meant and how to respond to it, simply held it, the way she had learned to hold things in Winterfell, with the patience of someone who has discovered that waiting without agenda is sometimes its own kind of strength. I believe you, he said. 3 words. She had negotiated treaties with more syllables. She had constructed arguments of hundreds of carefully chosen words to produce effects less significant than the effect of those 3, delivered in Ned Stark's level voice, without decoration. The question, he continued, with the manner of a man who has processed the personal dimension and is now addressing the political one, not dismissing the personal, but setting it aside to return to. The way you set aside a burning thing while you address what it's setting fire to is what we do with what we know. What they knew was this: Joffrey Baratheon, first of his name, heir to the Iron Throne, was not Robert's son. The throne's succession was built on a lie. The lie had killed Jon Arryn, and somewhere in King's Landing's machinery of power, someone, or several someones, knew enough to protect the lie and had demonstrated willingness to kill in its defense. They worked through it together, in the manner they had developed over 3 years of marriage for problems that exceeded either of their individual capacities. Ned's moral clarity establishing the parameters of what could and could not be done. Cersei's political architecture identifying what those parameters made possible. 2 minds with entirely different tools building toward the same structure. We cannot bring this to Robert directly, Cersei said. Not yet. Not without understanding who else knows and what protections they have built. Agreed. The word came easily, he had learned, without entirely abandoning his instinct for directness. To recognize when indirection was not compromise but competence. Pycelle. Almost certainly. He is the Queen's Maester. He managed her pregnancies. He could not have been ignorant. She paused. He is also Tywin's creature in ways that are older and deeper than his service to Robert. This complicates things. Your father. She met his eyes. My father knew what kind of man Robert Baratheon was when the original arrangement was made. He is not a man who fails to plan for contingencies. She heard herself and added, with the honesty that had become structural rather than chosen. I don't know what he knew. I know what he is capable of knowing and choosing to use. Those are not the same thing. Can you find out? I can find out more than I know now. Whether I can find out everything. She shook her head slightly. My father keeps his own counsel in the places that matter most. Ned rose from the table and moved to the window, looking out over King's Landing with the expression he wore when he was thinking about the north, the faint internal distance of a man whose deepest reference point is always somewhere else. Lisa Tully sent a raven to Catelyn before Jon Arryn died, he said. She told her the Lannisters had poisoned him. Cersei went very still. Which Lannisters? She didn't specify, but the implication was my family, Cersei said. Yes. She worked through it, the ugly geometry of it, the way the accusation landed and what it meant. Lisa Arryn is not a stable woman. Her grief is real, but her judgment is not reliable. The accusation may be genuine belief without accurate basis. A pause, or someone put it in her mind deliberately. Littlefinger, Ned said. They looked at each other across the room, the windows gray. King's Landing light between them, the book on the table. The dead hand's careful handwriting still visible from where Cersei sat. He stood to gain from the chaos of Jon Arryn's death, Cersei said. A new hand from the north, unfamiliar with the court's machinery, would require guidance that is sufficiently positioned. Master of Coin could provide while appearing merely helpful. She paused. He was in love with your sister. With Catelyn Tully. Before she married Jon Arryn's ward. She watched Ned process this. Men like Littlefinger do not abandon their obsessions. They redirect them. If he could not have Catelyn, he might settle for destroying the world. That took her from him and rebuilding it in a shape more favorable to his ambitions. Chaos is a ladder. Ned said quietly. Someone had used the phrase in his presence recently. She could tell by the way he repeated it. The slight distance of a man quoting rather than originating. Yes. She rose from her chair and came to stand beside him at the window. Looking out over the city, they were both, in their different ways, trying to understand. Which means everything that has happened. Jon Arryn's death. The succession question, Lisa's accusation. Robert's summons, maybe pieces of something. Littlefinger has been building for years. A structure designed to produce chaos he can exploit. Below them, King's Landing moved through its afternoon. The market crowds on the street of silk. The gold cloaks patrol along the harbor wall. A merchant's cart overturned at a corner while its owner argued with the three people who had walked into it. Ordinary catastrophe. The city's texture. If Littlefinger built this, Ned said, then everything we do in response to what we've found is already part of his calculation. Perhaps, Cersei said, but he calculated without accounting for us. Specifically, for what we are together. She turned from the window to look at her husband. He would have calculated a Ned Stark who came south alone, honorable, direct, politically vulnerable, susceptible to the manipulation of his instinct toward justice. He would have calculated a Cersei Lannister who married Robert, ambitious, isolated, defending a secret at any cost. Reactive. She paused. He did not calculate this. Ned turned from the window to look at her, and she saw in his gray eyes the thing she had been building toward for 3 years without knowing. She was building toward it. The specific trust of a man who has tested someone against every standard he holds and found them not perfect, not uncomplicated, but genuinely, structurally reliable. What do we do? He asked. We find Varys, Cersei said. Not to trust him, to understand what he already knows and what he intends to do with it. Information about information is still information. She took a breath. And then we go to Jaime. Ned's expression did not change dramatically. Your brother. My brother is the Kingslayer because he killed a mad king to save 500,000 people and received only contempt for it, Cersei said. And the words carried something. She had never permitted herself to feel fully about this, the injustice of it, the specific Westerosi cruelty of a World that gave a man no good choices and then condemned him for the choice he made. He is also the only person in this city who would die before he let harm come to me or to my children. Our children. The correction came easier now than it once had. He needs to know what we know, and he needs to decide what he is. What he is, Ned said slowly, testing the phrase. A Kingsguard sworn to protect the king and the king's family, Cersei said. Or a Lannister who understands that the king's family is built on a lie that will destroy the realm when it breaks open. She met Ned's eyes. He cannot be both. And Jaime has been trying to be both his entire life, which is what has been breaking him. She paused. It is time to give him a third option. Outside the window, the afternoon light was shifting toward the gold of early evening. The particular King's Landing gold that was nothing like Lannister gold. Warmer, less intentional. The light of a city that would burn as indifferently as it glittered. In the far north, beyond the wall. Beyond the reach of political calculation and genealogical evidence, in the careful architecture of human scheming. Something ancient moved through perpetual cold with the patience of a thing that has been waiting long enough that waiting has become simply the texture of existence. It did not know about the book on the table. It did not know about the conversation at the window. It did not know about the Stark Lannister marriage or the succession's lie or Littlefinger's ladder or any of the 10,000 human urgencies that filled the warm south with noise and motion and the illusion of consequence. It knew only that it was still winter, and that winter, eventually, came for everything. Jaime Lannister had spent 7 years wearing a dead man's armor. Not literally, the white cloak of the Kingsguard was maintained with the obsessive precision of an institution that understood symbols better than it understood people, cleaned and pressed and immaculate, at every public appearance regardless of what happened in the private hours. But the man inside the armor had died, or something essential in him had died, in the throne room of the Red Keep on the day he drove his sword through the Mad King's back and sat down on the steps of the Iron Throne to wait for whoever came next. He had waited with the particular blankness of someone who has used up his entire reserve of moral certainty in a single action and has not yet determined where to find more. Robert had come next and had looked at him with the contempt that becomes legend. Ned Stark had come next. This Ned, the one who existed in this particular life. The one who had not married his childhood love's ghost, but had married Cersei instead, and had looked at him with the same measured assessment. He gave everything. The look that was not yet judgment, but was not yet acquittal either. Justice held in suspension, waiting for more evidence. In the 7 years since, Jaime had been performing the Kingslayer. It was the role the world had written for him, and the world had been remarkably consistent about insisting he play it, in the contempt of lords who would not meet his eyes, in the careful distance of the Kingsguard brothers who served beside him, in the specific way that men who needed the Kingsguard's protection managed to convey, with every interaction, that they considered his protection slightly tainted. He had learned to wear the contempt like a second cloak, had learned to make the smirk the armor's outside face, the golden insolent surface that told the world he didn't care what it thought, which had the advantage of being half true and the disadvantage of being only half true. Cersei had written him letters, careful letters, managed letters, nothing that the wrong hands could use. But she had written the actual thing inside the careful language, had written him as a person rather than a symbol, had asked questions that required genuine answers rather than performance. And somewhere in the 2 years of careful correspondence, something in him had shifted in the way of ice, shifting in a river, not breaking yet, but moving. The first motion of a thing that has been frozen for too long, beginning to remember what flowing felt like. When she sent for him, it was through a channel so unremarkable, a servant he recognized from childhood at the Rock, carrying a message about a dinner that wasn't a dinner, that he almost smiled at the elegance of it. Cersei had learned subtlety in the north. The irony was not lost on him. He came to their chambers in the Tower of the Hand in the late evening, after the keep's social machinery had wound down to its nighttime hum, and found them both waiting, his sister and her husband, sitting on opposite sides of a table, with a book between them and the particular quality of stillness that two people develop when they have been talking about something serious and have paused to let the serious thing breathe before the next. conversation. He had seen them together at public functions, had watched them across throne rooms and feast halls, with the attention of someone conducting an extended assessment, and had arrived at a conclusion he didn't fully trust because it contradicted his expectations too completely. They were, by every observable measure, a genuine partnership, not performance, not the careful management of mutual advantage that most noble marriages settled into, something that had apparently grown in the absence of his supervision, into a thing he could not find a precedent for in his experience of how people related to each other. He looked at Ned Stark across the table and found Ned Stark looking back with the same level assessment. The man who had found him on the steps of the Iron Throne and looked at him with justice held in suspension, looking at him still with that same deliberate openness. And Jaime felt something that was not quite the contempt he was accustomed to receiving, and was not quite the forgiveness he had stopped expecting. It was something more uncomfortable than either. It was the sense of being seen as a person rather than a verdict. "Sit down, Jaime," Cersei said. He sat. She told him. She told him with the complete honesty that Winterfell had apparently installed in her, not the managed revelation of someone delivering information strategically, but the full accounting. The book and the annotations and Jon Arryn and Littlefinger and all of it, laid out with the systematic clarity of someone who has determined that the only path through a terrible thing is straight through the middle of it. Jaime listened without interrupting, which was not his natural mode, but which the weight of what she was saying imposed on him the way physical weight imposes stillness. When she finished, the room was quiet with the specific quiet of a space that has just received something too large for its ordinary dimensions. "You've known," he said finally, not accusatory, the observation of a man locating himself in a map that has just been significantly redrawn. "I have suspected for a long time," Cersei said. "I have known with certainty for less than a fortnight." Jaime looked at the book. He looked at Ned. He looked at his sister. He performed the private mathematics of a man, calculating what a piece of information this size meant for every structure he could identify, and the calculation produced results that were uniformly and comprehensively terrible. "If this becomes known." "When?" Ned said quietly. "Not if. Jon Arryn found it. We have found it. The pattern is not subtle enough to remain hidden indefinitely, and Littlefinger has been maneuvering to expose it at a moment of his choosing." He paused. "We need to choose the moment first." Jaime looked at the hand of the king, this honest northern lord who had taken his sister from the life she might have lived and made her into something. Jaime was still in the process of understanding and felt the specific vertigo of a man discovering that the person he has been most uncertain about is, in the current crisis, the most reliable fixed point available. "Robert will want to kill her," Jaime said. "Not Cersei, the queen, the other Cersei, the one who had made different choices in this life's alternate arrangement. And the children. Robert cannot know before we have protections in place," Cersei said. "That is the first and most essential constraint on everything we do from this moment forward." "The children are innocent," Ned said, and the words carried the absolute weight of his deepest conviction, the thing in him that could not be argued or maneuvered. That was simply there like bedrock. Whatever the truth of their parentage, they are children. They will not be harmed. Jaime looked at this man who had been looking at him for 7 years with justice held in suspension, and felt the suspension resolve, not into absolution, not into the erasure of what the Kingslayer had done and been and worn as penance, but into something more honest than either recognition. The recognition of a man who makes hard choices in impossible situations, by one who had done the same and received only the world's contempt for the doing. "What do you need from me?" Jaime asked. What they needed from him was the Kingsguard's access, the Lannister name's authority in specific corridors of power, and the particular capability of a man who had spent 7 years being underestimated, which was the one advantage the Kingslayer's reputation provided, the way a reputation for foolishness provides the freedom to observe without being watched. They worked through the night, the 3 of them, around the table with the book and the fire and the sounds of the sleeping keep around them. Ned provided the moral architecture, the parameters, the lines that could not be crossed. the protections that were non-negotiable. Cersei provided the political machinery, the sequence of moves, the levers to be applied, the order of operations that would build toward the necessary outcome with minimum catastrophic exposure. Jaime provided what neither of them had: the internal knowledge of the Kingsguard structure, Robert's daily movements and habits, and the specific vulnerabilities of a king who trusted his physical safety to an institution and his political safety to no one. By the time the sky beyond the window was beginning to consider the possibility of dawn, they had the outline of something that was not quite a plan and not quite a conspiracy, and was most accurately described as an attempt to manage an unmanageable situation with the tools available. Varys, Cersei said, returning to the thread she had identified the previous day. He knows more than he has shown. He always does. Varys serves the realm, Ned said, or claims to. If the succession's truth becomes his leverage, then we approach him before it does, Cersei said. We make him an offer of information in exchange for information, from a position of enough knowledge that he understands concealment from us is no longer possible. She paused. He will not be controlled, but he can be aligned. If his goal is genuinely the realm's stability, our goal and his goal are the same goal. And if his goal is something else, then we know that too, which is information we need. Jaime, who had been listening to this with the focused attention of a man learning a language in real time, said, "And Littlefinger?" The question sat in the room. Cersei and Ned looked at each other in the brief silent communication they had developed, not the twin language that Jaime shared with his sister, something different, something built rather than born. Two people who had chosen to understand each other rather than simply finding themselves understood. Littlefinger is the most dangerous element, Cersei said, because he has no fixed loyalty and no moral constraint and the intelligence to exploit any gap we leave. She paused. He also has a weakness. Which is? Jaime asked. He believes he is the only one who understands how chaos works, Ned said. And Jaime turned to look at him. This Lord of the North. This honest man, using the language of political warfare with the calm specificity of someone who has been learning a second language and has just discovered he is more fluent than he realized. He has built his entire position on the assumption that the people around him are either too honorable or too corrupt to see the board the way he sees it. He has never encountered someone who is both, Cersei said quietly. Jaime looked at his sister. He looked at her husband. He thought about the word both and what it contained, the honor that would not bend on the things that mattered most, and the political fluency that knew how to protect the things that mattered most, operating in the same body of alliance, the same shared purpose. He thought about what he had been for 7 years. The Kingslayer, the man who killed for the right reason and wore the wrong name for it ever after, trapped between what he had done and what he was, unable to be fully either, because the world had decided he was only one thing, and he had eventually agreed. I want a different name, he said, and the words surprised him slightly as they left. The sound of something he had not known he was going to say until he said it. Cersei looked at him. What? When this is over, Jaime said. When? Whatever we're building here holds or falls. I want to be something other than the Kingslayer. He met his sister's eyes and then, with the effort of a man doing something genuinely difficult, met Ned's. I don't know what that is yet, but I want the chance to find out. Ned Stark looked at him for a long moment with justice, no longer held in suspension but resolved into something. That was not absolution. Ned Stark did not traffic in absolution. It was not his currency, but was honest acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a man who has killed necessary things and known the cost of necessary killing, and does not pretend that cost can be erased. Then help us protect the innocent, Ned said. Start there. The rest follows from the start. It was not a pardon. It was not an erasure. It was something more demanding than either, the offer of a direction rather than a destination, the chance to build something new on the rubble of what had been, without any promise that the building would stand. Outside the window, the sky over King's Landing had made its decision about dawn and was proceeding with it, gray first, then the particular rose gold of a southern morning, the light coming off the bay in long bright lines across the city's crowded rooftops. A new day arriving with the complete indifference of days to what had happened in the night. somewhere beneath them in the keep's lower levels. Robert Baratheon was sleeping off the previous evening's wine, dreaming whatever kings dream when they drink enough, to stop dreaming about what they've lost. In the corridors, the first servants of the morning shift were beginning their quiet work. Ravens moved between the rookeries with the knights' accumulated messages. And in the Tower of the Hand, free people, who should by every calculation of Westerosi politics have been each other's enemies, sat around a table with a dangerous book and a more dangerous truth and the bare outline of a plan that had no guarantee and no precedent. It was, Jaime thought, the most honest room he had been in since the throne room. And the last honest room had cost him everything. He decided, in the gray light of the King's Landing morning, that some things were worth the cost. He had known this once. He had known it on the steps of the Iron Throne, sitting in the Mad King's blood, waiting for the next king to arrive and render his verdict. He had simply been waiting, in the 7 years since, for someone to confirm it. He supposed, looking at his sister and her husband in the growing light, that this was what confirmation looked like. Nothing like he had imagined. Better, in the ways that actually mattered. Harder, in all the same ways. Varys received them in his chambers, at the hour before the small council's morning session, which was itself a communication, the master of whisperers, choosing the meeting's time and location, with the careful intentionality he applied to all things, ensuring they came to him rather than summoning him, establishing from the first moment the particular texture of an encounter he had clearly been anticipating. He had tea prepared, 3 cups. Cersei noted this with the automatic attention she gave to details that revealed information. He had known they were coming, which meant his network had observed either their nighttime conference or their morning decision to seek him, which meant the Tower of the Hand was less private than they had believed, which meant every conversation they had conducted in its chambers required immediate reassessment. She sat without showing she had noted it. Ned sat beside her with the composed alertness of a man who had been briefed on the opponent and was now conducting his own primary assessment. Jaime had remained behind. His presence at this meeting would have concentrated too much Lannister visibility in one room, and Cersei had not yet determined the full geometry of Varys's loyalties, which meant minimizing his leverage points was more important than maximizing their visible unity. Lady Stark, Varys said, settling into his chair with the boneless ease of a very comfortable cat. Lord Stark, I confess I have been wondering how long it would take you to find me. You've been waiting, Ned said. Not a question. I have been waiting for some time. Yes. Varys folded his hands in his sleeves and regarded them with the bright, unreadable attention of a man behind very thick glass. Jon Arryn came to me 3 weeks before he died. He had found the same thing you have found. And he came to me because he had reached the limit of what he could do with it, alone, and required the kind of assistance that cannot be obtained through official channels. He paused. I gave him what help I could. It was not sufficient. He was poisoned, Cersei said. He was poisoned, Varys confirmed, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone confirming a weather report. Tears of bliss, administered through his wine over several weeks, slow enough to appear as natural decline, fast enough to prevent the question he had almost finished asking from receiving its answer. Who administered it? Ned said. That question has a complicated answer. Varys tilted his head slightly. The immediate hand was Lisa Arryn's. The instruction behind the hand was Peter Baelish's. The political calculation behind the instruction was more diffuse. The room was very quiet. Outside, King's Landing was assembling itself for another day of commerce and scheming and the 1,000 ordinary activities that constituted the city's surface, while its depths conducted their separate business. Lisa killed her own husband, Cersei said, and the words tasted like what they were. The specific sourness of a thing you suspected and hoped to be wrong about. Confirmed. Lisa Arryn has been Peter Baelish's instrument for many years, Varys said. Since childhood, one might argue. Though childhood is a complicated defense. He considered his tea. Lord Baelish identified her susceptibility and cultivated it with the patience he brings to all long investments. When the time came to remove Jon Arryn, when it became clear that the hand had found the succession's truth and would act on it in ways that disrupted the careful chaos Lord Baelish had been constructing. Lisa was the instrument available. And the accusation against the Lannisters, Ned said. The Raven to Catelyn. Also Baelish, Varys said. A masterwork of misdirection. If one can admire craftsmanship independent of its application. Sending the accusation to Lady Stark through Lisa ensured it would reach Lord Stark with the emotional weight of family warning rather than anonymous intelligence. It would have driven you south in grief and suspicion. Lord Stark, primed to see Lannister treachery in every shadow and therefore positioned to move against the wrong enemy while the right one arranged the board to his advantage. It didn't work, Ned said, because I came south with my wife. Varys looked at Cersei with an expression she could not fully decode, something between satisfaction and the particular appreciation of a man who has watched a game develop in a direction that surprised him pleasantly. Indeed, Lord Baelish did not account for the variable of your marriage's actual nature. He calculated, as most of the court calculated, that the Stark-Lannister alliance was a political arrangement, with the usual political architecture, two people managing shared interests from separate positions. He paused. He did not calculate genuine collaboration. It is, I confess, rather rarer than its reputation suggests. What do you want from us? Cersei said. Not what do you know and not what will you do. The direct question that cut to the only thing that mattered in a conversation with Varys, which was the price of his assistance. Everything else was theater. Varys looked at her with something that might, on a different face, have been a smile. I want what I have always wanted, my lady. A realm that does not tear itself apart. He set down his teacup. I have been serving that goal through a series of calculations that the current situation has rendered partially obsolete. I calculated for years around the succession's lie, managing it, maintaining it, determining how to transfer the throne. When the lie inevitably collapsed without producing the war that truth, badly handled, always produces. A pause. Your presence here and what you have found, and the fact that you have not yet done anything irreversible with it, suggests that you are attempting something similar. We are attempting to protect innocent children, Ned said, and to give Robert the truth in a manner that does not produce the war you're describing. Those goals, Varys said carefully, are not entirely compatible. The silence that followed was the silence of a truth being received that everyone in the room had known and no one had yet said aloud. Ned received it with the particular stillness of a man standing in cold water, not flinching, not retreating, simply present in the discomfort of it. Robert will want justice, Ned said. Robert will want blood, Cersei corrected. And the words were precise and ungentle because they needed to be. Robert's grief and Robert's rage are not distinguishable from each other at the best of times. And the revelation that his heir is not his heir will not produce the best of times. She paused. The Queen's children must be removed from Robert's reach before the truth is told. That is the non-negotiable constraint. After that, the manner of telling becomes the primary question. The Queen, Varys said carefully, is not without her own resources. She has Qyburn's counsel, and the gold cloak's partial loyalty through Janos Slint. He looked at Cersei with the directness of a man delivering information that carries its own warning. She is aware that her position is precarious. She has been aware for some time. She is not a woman who waits passively for precarity to resolve itself. No, Cersei said. She is not. The understanding moved through the room like cold air through a cracked door. Cersei, the Queen, the other Cersei, the road not taken, was building her own protections. She knew the succession's truth was vulnerable. She had Qyburn and the gold cloaks, and the particular ruthlessness of a woman who had survived an unhappy marriage to a king by developing the skills that unhappiness and marriage and kingship require. She was not going to be a passive piece in anyone else's game. We need to move faster than we planned, Ned said. Yes, Cersei agreed. The children first, he said. Whatever else happens, the children first. The Queen received them in her solar the following afternoon with the composed wariness of a woman who has been expecting a confrontation and has spent the intervening time deciding which version of herself to present to it. She was magnificent in the way that things built entirely for their purpose are magnificent. The golden hair, the green eyes, the absolute control of every physical signal she permitted to reach the surface. She looked at Cersei with the specific attention of a woman, examining her own reflection in a distorted mirror. And Cersei looked back with the same quality of recognition. They were, in the ways that mattered, the same person diverged. Same father, same childhood. Same tools acquired for the same reasons in the same environment. Different choices, or different choices made for them, which had produced. Cersei was aware of the uncomfortable irony of this assessment. Genuinely different people. Ned stood slightly behind Cersei's right shoulder, which was a position they had established through practice, rather than discussion, the visible indication that they were a unified front without requiring him to lead a conversation that required her particular fluency. You found it, the Queen said. No preface, no social architecture around it. The directness of a woman who has determined that pretense is a resource she cannot afford to spend. Yes, Cersei said. Jon Arryn found it first, the Queen said. I didn't kill him. She looked at Ned when she said it, to him specifically, not to Cersei. The instinct of a woman who has spent years learning to identify where actual authority sits regardless of performance. I want that understood. I did not order Jon Arryn's death. We know, Ned said. We know who did. Something shifted. In the Queen's expression, the fractional relaxation of someone who has been holding a position and discovers unexpectedly that they don't need to hold it quite so hard. Then you know more than I do, she said, with the honest admission of a woman who has been operating with incomplete information and is intelligent enough to recognize the limitation. Baelish, Cersei said, through Lisa Arryn. The Queen absorbed this with the focused stillness of someone fitting a piece into a structure that has been missing it. The Raven to the Stark woman. His work, designed to send Ned south suspicious and isolated. Cersei paused. It did not produce the intended result. The Queen looked at her, really looked at her. The assessment of a peer rather than a rival. The recalibration of a woman who has been calculating around an assumption and has just found the assumption was wrong. No, she said slowly. I can see that. Another pause, longer. What do you want? The children, Ned said. Your children are innocent. They will not be harmed. That is our promise, and it is not conditional. The Queen looked at him for a long moment. Cersei watched her look, watched her find what Cersei had found in Ned's directness. 3 years ago in Winterfell, standing over warm stones in the early morning cold. The thing that had no gap in it. The thing that meant exactly what it said because it had no mechanism for meaning anything else. You mean that, the Queen said. Not a question. I mean everything I say, Ned told her. It is my only real quality. Something happened in the Queen's expression that Cersei recognized because she had felt it, the specific disorientation of encountering honesty in a place that has trained you to expect weaponry. The Queen's green eyes moved from Ned to Cersei and back again, and Cersei saw her performing the same recalibration that Cersei had performed in Winterfell's library, in the solar, in 100 small moments of encountering a man who had no second layer. Joffrey will not accept diminished inheritance quietly, the Queen said. He is, she stopped, started again. He has been raised to believe he is heir to the Iron Throne. The belief has not improved his character. Joffrey's character is a separate problem from Joffrey's safety, Ned said. We address them separately. And Robert. The name landed in the room with its full weight. They all felt it. The king-shaped problem at the center of everything. The man whose grief and rage and genuine good heart, buried under years of disappointment, would receive this truth in the worst possible way unless it was delivered with a care that Robert Baratheon's own personality made nearly impossible to apply. Robert is our problem, Cersei said. Not yours. Not any longer. The Queen looked at her for a long moment. This woman who was herself and not herself. This road not taken made flesh. This version of Cersei Lannister that the world had made instead. When the choices went differently, Cersei looked back and felt, with a complexity she would not try to simplify, the vast structural difference between who she was and who this woman had become, and the smaller, more uncomfortable recognition of how much they still shared. What do you need from me? The Queen asked. Tell us where Qyburn is, Cersei said. And tell us what you've promised Janos. Slint. We cannot protect your children if we're operating blind to your existing arrangements. The queen was quiet for a moment, the last moment Cersei recognized of a woman deciding whether to trust, which was always the most dangerous decision and always the most necessary one when you had run out of alternatives. Then she told them, outside the queen's solar, in the corridor where two gold cloaks stood at inattentive guard, a small figure detached from the shadow of a doorway and moved silently through the keep's afternoon traffic toward the Tower of the Hand. Not one of Varys's birds this time, one of Littlefinger's, a child with quick ears and a copper coin and the trained invisibility of the city's disposable poor. The coin would buy Littlefinger information. The information would tell him the Stark Lannister alliance had found the queen and was building something he had not anticipated. And Littlefinger, receiving information that is carefully constructed chaos was being countered by a collaboration his calculations had not accounted for, would do what Littlefinger always did when his plans encountered genuine resistance. He would accelerate. In 3 days, the small council would convene for a routine session. In 2 days, a raven would arrive from the Eyrie bearing Lisa Aaron's testimony about her husband's death, revised and redirected by a hand that understood how testimony could be shaped. In 1 day, something would happen in the city's lower quarters that would require the gold cloaks attention in a specific direction at a specific hour, leaving a specific corridor of the Red Keep unguarded at a specific time. Littlefinger had been building this for years. He had not survived the transition from nothing to master of coin buy, constructing plans with single points of failure. What he had constructed was a cascade, each element triggering the next, each complication of his opponents producing exactly the chaos he required, moving with the terrible momentum of a thing designed to be unstoppable once it began. He had not, in all his construction, accounted for a single variable. He had not accounted for the possibility that Ned Stark's most significant political asset was not the Lannister alliance or the Northern armies or the Hand's authority. It was that Ned Stark, in 3 years of marriage to the most politically intelligent woman in the realm, had learned to think 2 moves ahead. And Cersei Lannister, in 3 years of marriage to the most honest man in the realm, had learned that some things are worth protecting with everything you have. In the Tower of the Hand, Jaime Lannister was already moving. Littlefinger moved on a Thursday, because chaos, in his experience, preferred the middle of the week, the days when attention was distributed across too many ordinary obligations to consolidate quickly around an emergency. The raven from the Eyrie arrived at dawn, as planned, bearing Lisa's testimony in its revised form, a document that named the Lannisters broadly in Jon Arryn's death, written in Lisa's recognizable hand and sealed with the Arryn falcon, designed to land on the small council's table at the morning session and produce the specific combustion of a king's grief ignited by a plausible enemy. Robert receiving it in open council, surrounded by lords whose responses he would read as confirmation, would be Robert at his most dangerous, the emotional man given a direction for his rage and the institutional authority to act on it immediately. The gold cloak's misdirection was already in place, a manufactured disturbance in Flea Bottom that would pull Janos Slent's attention and half his men to the wrong part of the city at the critical hour. Qyburn had been given instructions that Littlefinger had ensured would keep him occupied in his chambers below the keep, his particular brand of useful horror temporarily redirected. And somewhere in the city's merchant quarter, a Braavosi coin changer was holding funds in trust for a man who might need to leave King's Landing quickly and establish himself somewhere with a fresh name and cooperative local governance. Littlefinger had not built the ladder by failing to prepare his own descent. What he had not prepared was Jaime Lannister standing in the small council chamber at the hour before dawn with the raven already in his hand. Not intercepted, Jaime was not stupid enough to intercept a royal communication, which would be detectable and actionable. He had simply arrived first, before the maester's morning rounds, before the chamber's servants, before the council members who would filter in with their various agendas and performances. He had read the raven with the cold, focused attention of a man who has spent 7 years learning to read the space between what is said and what is meant. and he had set it back in its place on the council table with the careful precision of someone who has touched nothing. He had also, in the hour before his arrival in the council chamber, done three other things. The first was a conversation with Ser Barristan Selmy, the Lord, commander of the King's Guard, the finest knight in the realm, a man of such absolute and uncomplicated honor that even the Kingslayer's reputation had never been able to make him cruel in his dealings with Jaime, who had always responded to Barristan's decency with the particular ache of someone who has lost something and is occasionally reminded of what it felt like. Jaime had told Barristan enough of the truth to ensure the Lord Commander understood that the morning's small council session required his presence and his attention, and that certain instructions about the protection of the king's children might need to supersede certain other instructions before the session concluded. Barristan had listened with the focused gravity of a man who takes duty seriously enough to understand when duty's demands are complicated, and had nodded once, which was his version of a sworn oath. The second thing was a message delivered by a servant Cersei had identified as genuinely reliable, the rarest commodity in King's Landing, to Varys, confirming the morning's timeline and requesting that his network be positioned to observe and record rather than intervene, unless the situation moved beyond the established parameters. Varys's little birds, watching from their invisible stations in the walls and corridors and forgotten spaces of the Red Keep, would be the evidence collection that a formal accusation would eventually require. Varys had sent back a single word, understood. The third thing was a conversation with his sister in the gray hour before dawn, standing in the tower of the Hands corridor with the sleeping keep around them and the particular quality of early morning silence that strips away every performance and leaves only what's actually there. If this goes wrong, Jaime had said. It won't, Cersei had said. If it does. She had looked at him in the dim torchlight, with the green eyes that were there, mother's eyes, and said, then we face what comes. Together, all three of us. A pause. That is what you wanted, isn't it? Something to stand in. Not just something to stand for. He had understood what she meant. He had been standing for things his entire life. For the king. For the King's Guard. For the Lannister name. For the abstract principle of a mad king's subjects. Deserving better than Dragonfire. Standing in something was different. Standing in something meant you were part of its structure. Load-bearing, necessary, not a symbol. Attached to a cause, but a person. Embedded in a web of genuine relationships that would be diminished by your absence. He had not had that since before the throne room. Since before the Mad King. And the choice and the name that followed the choice like a shadow. Yes, he had said. That's what I wanted. Robert arrived at the small council chamber at the appointed hour in the expansive good humor of a man who has slept well and eaten a large breakfast and has not yet encountered the day's specific variety of bad news and found, instead of the council's usual arrangement of carefully positioned advisors performing their morning readiness, Ned Stark sitting at the tables, head with his wife beside him in a collection of documents, arranged in the precise order of a man who has been preparing for this conversation for several days. Robert's good humor underwent a rapid reassessment. Ned, what's all this? Sit down, Robert, Ned said, with the gentleness of a man delivering a hard thing to someone he loves, which was the only mode of delivery he had for hard things to people he loved. Not softening the thing, but softening the approach, making the arrival as bearable as the truth permitted. Robert sat. Ned told him, not everything at once. Cersei had designed the sequence with the care of someone who understands that a king's emotional responses need to be managed in their order as carefully as their content. That Robert receiving the succession's truth before understanding the conspiracy around it would produce explosion before comprehension. An explosion before comprehension in Robert Baratheon tended to produce irreversible consequences. She had constructed a narrative that moved Robert through grief toward anger toward the specific cold clarity of a man who has been betrayed not by those he suspected, but by the machinery that surrounded him. Littlefinger's construction, Lisa's instrument, the careful long deception of a system that had been exploiting his grief and his trust simultaneously. Robert listened with the focused Stillness of a man being struck repeatedly by things he cannot deflect. His face moved through the stages of it, the denial, the anger beginning to build, the grief underneath the anger that was always Robert's truest register, the specific sorrow of a man who has discovered that the people he trusted with his comfort were the people most efficiently harvesting it. When Ned reached the succession, the genealogical evidence, the pattern, the book with John Aaron's careful annotations, Robert went very quiet in the way of large things going quiet, the stillness of something that contains enormous force and is currently containing it at considerable cost. The children, he said. His voice was level in the specific way of a man, controlling his voice with his entire available will. Are innocent, Ned said. They will not be harmed, Robert. I need you to hear that before anything else. Robert stopped. Started again. Joffrey is not mine. No. The silence that followed was the longest in the room's history, which was considerable. This chamber had hosted decisions that had reshaped the realm, betrayals that had ended dynasties, the quiet administrative violence of 1,000 small council sessions. It had not hosted a silence quite like this one, which contained, inside it, the entire architecture of a man's life being rebuilt from the foundation at significant speed. Cersei watched Robert and thought about the versions of this moment she had imagined: the explosion, the reach for his sword, the royal rage that would require physical intervention and produce casualties and damage that would take years to repair. She had planned for all of them. She had positioned Jaime and Barristan outside the chamber door, had ensured the room contained no weapons beyond Ned's sword which he would not draw, had structured the conversation to reach the children before Robert reached the rage. What she had not planned for, could not have planned for, had not known to plan for was Robert looking at Ned Stark across the table with the grief of a man who has just lost not only his heir, but the particular illusion that had made his reign bearable, and saying, "Did you know? When you came south, did you know? We found it here," Ned said. "We did not come south knowing." But she, Robert's eyes moved to Cersei, not with the rage she had expected, with something more complicated, the look of a man trying to understand something in a framework that is currently being rebuilt. "You're a Lannister." I am a Stark," Cersei said, and the words came out with a conviction that surprised her in the moment of saying them, the sound of something she had not known was fully true until the truth of it was required. "I have been a Stark for 3 years. What I am protects your children, Robert, not threatens them. That is the only thing that matters in this room right now." Robert looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the exhausted simplicity of a man who has run out of performance and is left with only what he actually is, he put his face in his hands. Ned rose from his seat and came around the table and put his hand on Robert's shoulder in the way of a man who has known someone since boyhood and knows that what they need at their worst moment is not words, but simple presence. Robert accepted it with the unself-conscious need of someone beyond caring about dignity. And Cersei watched her husband with his hand on his oldest friend's shoulder and felt the specific quality of something she had been building for 3 years achieve its full structural integrity. This was what she had not known she was building toward. Not power, not position, not the careful management of political advantage. A room where a king could put his face in his hands and a good man could stand beside him and it would be enough. It would be sufficient, it would hold. Littlefinger was arrested at the 3rd hour of the afternoon by Ser Barristan. Selmy himself, accompanied by 6 members of the King's Guard and a written order, bearing Robert's seal and Ned's signature as hand. The order cited conspiracy in the murder of John Arryn, falsification of royal testimony, and corruption of crown finances. The last charge accompanied by a financial accounting that Cersei had spent the previous 3 weeks constructing from the harbor master's evidence, and the royal accountant's terrified cooperation, documented with the thoroughness of someone who understands that an accusation requires architecture. Littlefinger received his arrest with the composed equanimity of a man who has always known this was a possible destination and has arranged his affairs accordingly. The Bravosi funds, the exit routes, the contingency names, what he had not arranged for, and what was visible in the fractional recalibration of his expression when Ser Barristan read the charges was the completeness of the accounting. Someone had spent considerable time understanding how his systems worked from the inside. He looked, in the moment before his composure reasserted itself, at the document in Ser Barristan's hand, and then looked up at Cersei Lannister standing at the Lord Commander's right shoulder, and understood. "Lady Stark," he said. "Lord Baelish," she replied. "Chaos, I find, is only a ladder if you're the only one who can see it." He was taken to the black cells with the efficiency of an institution that has had considerable practice in the logistics of powerful men's falls, and King's Landing adjusted around his absence with the elastic pragmatism of a city that has witnessed the falls of powerful men before and will witness them again. The Queen and her children were gone before the afternoon's end, removed with Jaime's assistance and Varys's logistical architecture to a location that Cersei knew and Ned knew and Robert had been told in the careful language of a man protecting innocents rather than abetting enemies. It was not absolution for the Queen. It was not the erasure of consequences. It was the protection of children from a storm they had not created, which was the non-negotiable constraint from which everything else had been built. What came after was the complicated work of a realm being rebuilt around a truth it had not been told, the succession's repair, the financial system's reconstruction, Robert's grief being converted slowly and imperfectly into the thing grief sometimes becomes in strong people, which is not healing exactly but the absorbed scar of something survived. Robert named Ned Hand formally at the small council's next session, with the specific words of a man who has decided to trust the person most capable of deserving it, which was not how Robert made most of his decisions, but was how he made this one. Cersei sat at the table's end, not as a council member, but as the Hand's wife and as the woman who had built the financial accounting that had brought Littlefinger down, and the council received her presence with the adjusted respect of people updating their calculations. Jaime stood his post at the chamber door in white cloak and golden armor, and if his posture was slightly different from the Kingslayer's habitual performance, slightly less ironic, slightly more present, the bearing of a man who has found a direction and is moving in it, the small council was too busy adjusting to the new arrangement to notice. Varys noticed. Varys noticed everything and filed it in the place where he filed things that might matter later, which was the same place he filed everything. The Raven arrived from the wall on the fortnight's last day, bearing Jon Snow's careful handwriting and the measured language of a young man learning to write the Night's Watch's particular register, formal, precise, stripped of sentiment in the way of people who live with danger, close enough to make sentiment expensive, but beneath the formal report of the wall's condition and the watch's status. In the private note folded inside the official communication, Jon had written 4 words that arrived in Ned's hand and produced in his expression the look that Cersei had learned to recognize as his deepest concern, the old, quiet expression that meant something was troubling him at the level beneath politics. He showed her the note without comment. "Something is wrong up here." Cersei read the 4 words and felt the cold that had nothing to do with King's Landing's summer temperature, the cold of something vast and patient and entirely indifferent to everything they had just accomplished, to Littlefinger's arrest and the succession's repair and the careful architecture of an alliance that had just proven it could hold under pressure. She looked up from the note at her husband, and Ned looked back at her, and between them moved the understanding that had been building for 3 years. The shared knowledge of 2 people who have learned to think together, who have built something real in a world designed to prevent real things, who have survived the Game of Thrones to find that the Game of Thrones was never the point. The point was north. It had always been north. Winter had been coming while they navigated King's Landing's golden corridors and Robert's grief and Littlefinger's ladder, moving with the terrible patience of something that does not need to hurry because it has already been waiting for longer than any of their schemes or alliances or honest marriages have been alive. Ned set the note down on the table with the careful deliberateness she had first seen 3 years ago in Winterfell's Solar, when a raven had arrived from Casterly Rock and he had read it twice and set it down with the manner of a man handling something he knew would changed the shape of his life. We need to go home, he said, not away from something, towards something, the wall and what lay beyond it, and the long, dark that no king's decree could hold at bay and no Lannister gold could purchase a reprieve from. Yes, Cersei said. She looked at the note in her husband's hand and thought of Alicent with her gray eyes and her mother's focused attention, learning politics and swords simultaneously, with the double inheritance of a girl who was entirely and irreducibly both of her parents. She thought of Willem with his red gold hair and his mother's temper and his father's stubborn integrity. These qualities currently deployed, primarily against his nursemaid, but building toward something more significant. She thought of the children she had made in a castle of hot springs and cold stone, in a marriage she had not chosen and had found, against every calculation she had ever constructed, to be the most important thing she had built. She thought of the North, which had changed her in ways she was still accounting for, and of the honest man who had changed her without trying, and of the crack in the armor that she had stopped trying to seal because what came through it was not weakness, but something she had not had a word for until Winterfell taught her one. She thought of 4 words written in a young man's careful hand on the wall's cold stone, and of the vast darkness beyond it that was patient in the way only things without human feeling could be patient, and of what it would mean to face that darkness with the foundations they had built. Outside the Tower of the Hand, King's Landing went about its business, the markets, and the harbor and the gold, cloaks patrol and the thousand ordinary urgencies of a city that does not pause for the private reckonings of the people who live inside its walls. The Iron Throne sat in its great hall, uncomfortable and patient, waiting for the next person to try to hold it. The small council would meet tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, managing the realm's needs with the imperfect instruments available. And in the far north, beyond the wall, beyond the reach of Lannister gold and Stark honor and the careful political architecture of alliances built in hard places, something ancient opened its blue eyes in the perpetual cold and turned its attention, with the glacial patience of a thing that measures time in seasons rather than years, toward the south. It had been waiting a long time. It was accustomed to waiting. But the waiting, the blue eyes suggested, was ending. They rode north together as autumn surrendered to winter's first serious advance. The kings rode hardening beneath their horses as the temperature fell with the steady purposefulness of a season that does not apologize for what it is. What they had built in King's Landing would hold or it would not. The succession's repair, the crown's financial reconstruction, Robert's grief slowly converting into the focused governance of a man who has stopped running from his own character. These things were in other hands now, competent hands, mostly. The realm was a vast and imperfect machine, and they had done what they could, with the portion of it accessible to 2 people working honestly in a world that preferred performance. What waited at Winterfell was Alicent and Willem in the particular daily urgencies of children who do not pause there, growing for their parents. Political crises. What waited beyond Winterfell, beyond the wall, in the blue-eyed patience of something that had been building toward this winter for longer than the Stark Lannister marriage had been alive, was everything else. Ned rode beside her in the comfortable silence they had built over 3 years of learning to occupy the same space without filling it unnecessarily. Cersei rode with the northern posture she had developed without noticing, the settled endurance of a woman who has learned that cold is not an obstacle but a condition, and conditions are what you work within. She had not expected this life. She had not expected any of what it had become. Winter was coming. She found, for the first time, that she was ready for it.